Have you ever stopped to think about what happens when a 71-year-old man decides to challenge a mountain no one dares to climb? I'm not talking about just any trail. I'm talking about a place where people simply disappear. A place where the silence is so heavy you can hear your own heart racing. And that's exactly where the story of William Harper begins. A war veteran from Montana, United States, who decided to accept the most insane challenge of his life. 72 hours alone on a forbidden mountain, accompanied only by his war dog, Thor. Now, before you think this is just another survival video, I need to tell you something. William is no ordinary adventurer. He's spent decades facing extreme situations, training military units in combat in hostile environments, and surviving missions most people couldn't even imagine. But even with all that experience, even with all that history of courage, there was something on that mountain he didn't expect to find. Something that completely changed the course of those 72 hours. And here comes Thor, a German shepherd trained in military operations, with razor-sharp instincts and unwavering loyalty. William and Thor have been through a lot together. Dangerous missions, risky situations, moments where survival depended on split-second decisions. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared them for what they would encounter on that mountain. Because Thor isn't just a dog. He's a battle companion, and it was he who saved William's life in a way you won't believe. Now, you might be wondering, why would a mountain be off limits? What's so dangerous up there that makes even locals avoid talking about it? Well, this mountain, located in the most isolated regions of Montana, is steeped in ancient legends. Stories of people who climbed it and never returned. Reports of unexplained sounds echoing among the rocks at night. And some say the mountain doesn't forgive those who disrespect it. William knew this. He knew the risks, but he climbed it anyway. Because for him, it wasn't just about survival. It was about proving that age doesn't define a man's limits. It was about showing that even at 71, he still had fire in his chest. But stay with me until the end, because what happened on the third day changed everything. William was exhausted, no drinking water. His body was failing. His mind was starting to play tricks. It was then that Thor began barking differently. A warning bark, an urgent bark, the kind that sends shivers down your spine. And it was at that moment that the pup did something unexpected. He grabbed William's jacket sleeve with his teeth and began dragging him to a part of the mountain he had never seen before. A hidden area, a place that shouldn't exist. Have you ever had that feeling that something is wrong, but you can't explain it? That's exactly what William felt when Thor took him there. The air was colder, the silence was suffocating, and then he saw it. What you're about to discover may surprise you, because what was in that place wasn't just a matter of physical survival, it was something much deeper, something that defies logic and messes with the mind. And that's where William's true journey begins, because surviving in the mountains was just the beginning. But before I tell you what William found in that hidden place, I need to pause here. If this topic resonates with you, if you also believe that age is no barrier, leave a comment below with what has touched you most so far. It could be your own story, it could be a reflection, it could even be a question about what happened to William and Thor. Because you see, this channel doesn't grow on its own. It grows because there are people like you who stop by, watch, interact, and share these stories. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this kind of content. And look, If you're enjoying this journey, if you're curious to know what Thor discovered on that forbidden mountain, leave a like now, because this simple gesture shows me that it's worth continuing to bring real stories of survival, of courage, of men and women who push their limits even when the world tells them to stop. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now and activate the bell, because I guarantee you what lies ahead in this story, and in the next ones I'll bring here, is hair-raising. These are accounts of real people facing extreme situations in places most of us would never dare to tread. I know it sounds cliché to ask this, but I'm serious. Every like, every comment, every new subscription makes a difference. It allows stories like William Harper's to reach more people. It ensures this kind of authentic, unfiltered, drama-free content continues to exist. And you're a part of that. So, what are you waiting for? Comment below, like this video, and subscribe. Now, let's get back to the mountains. Because what William saw when Thor dragged him to that hidden spot was something he never imagined he would find. Now that you understand the gravity of what was about to happen on that mountain, it's time to learn more about who William Harper is, and why a 71-year-old man would decide to take on such a challenge. Because you see, we're not talking about a sudden impulse or a belated midlife crisis. We're talking about a calculated decision made by someone who knows all too well the weight of the choices he makes. William Harper was born in a small town in rural Montana in 1953. He grew up in a family with a military tradition, where his father had served in World War II and his grandfather in the First. From a young age, William heard stories of resilience, of honor, of what it means to look danger in the face and not back down. These stories shaped who he would become. At 18, without hesitation, he enlisted in the United States Army. He went straight into the infantry, where he underwent intense training that prepared him not only physically, but also mentally for situations of extreme pressure. During his military career, William served in numerous missions around the world. He was in places where the heat was so unbearable that his skin burned just by touching the metal of the vehicles. He was in freezing regions where the temperature dropped so low that the simple act of breathing hurt his lungs. He learned to survive on the bare minimum, to make quick decisions when the lives of his comrades depended on it, and to trust his instincts even when logic seemed to point otherwise. William was not just another soldier. He was the kind of man others trusted when everything went wrong. After retiring from active duty, William couldn't just sit in a rocking chair and watch television. That wasn't his thing. He became an extreme environment survival instructor, training new soldiers and civilians seeking to learn resilience techniques. He taught young men how to make fire without matches, how to find water in unlikely places, and how to build shelters that would keep them alive during brutal storms. He imparted not only technical knowledge, but a philosophy of life. Respect nature, know your limits, but never accept them as permanent. But as the years passed, William began to feel something many men of his generation feel. A sense that the world was beginning to see him differently. People looked at him and saw only an old man, someone who should be at home, tending a garden, perhaps fishing in a quiet lake on Sundays. But William knew there was still fire inside him. He knew that the experience accumulated over decades didn't disappear just because a few strands of hair turned grey, or the wrinkles around his eyes deepened. He wanted to prove something, not only to others, but most importantly to himself. He wanted to show that age is just a number when you have determination, preparation, and courage. It was then that William heard about the mountain. It wasn't famous, It didn't have a pretty name or a well-marked trail that attracted tourists. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Locals avoided talking about it. When someone mentioned the place, conversations became tense, eyes shifted, and the subject quickly changed. There were ancient legends about that mountain, stories passed down from generation to generation as warnings, not entertainment. They said the mountain was cursed, that people had climbed it and never returned. Some accounts spoke of strange sounds echoing among the rocks at night, low moans that seemed to come from within the earth itself. Others spoke of an oppressive feeling of being watched, even when no one was around. There were also more recent stories of groups of adventurers who tried to camp there and had to rush down in the middle of the night, pale and silent, refusing to explain what they had seen or heard. Local authorities didn't officially prohibit access to the mountain, but they didn't encourage it either. There were no signs, no marked trails, and anyone who asked about the place received evasive answers. It was as if the community itself had made a silent agreement to keep people away. And that's exactly what caught William's attention. Because if there's one thing he's learned throughout his life, it's that the most dangerous places are also the ones that teach us the most about who we truly are. William began researching the mountain. He spoke with former residents, some of whom remembered stories told by their grandparents. He discovered that before European colonization, Native American tribes considered the place sacred, but also forbidden. It was an area only shamans could enter, and even then, only on very specific occasions. There was something about that mountain that demanded respect, something that couldn't easily be explained with words. But William wasn't interested in folklore. He was interested in the real challenge. He wanted to know if he could survive 72 hours in that hostile environment, alone, with minimal resources. He wanted to test his physical and mental limits in a place where conditions were unpredictable, and the isolation was total. And he was certain that if he succeeded, he would prove not only to himself, but to everyone around him, that experience and determination trump youth when it comes to true survival. Of course, William wasn't naive. He knew that at 71, his body didn't respond the way it had at 30. His joints ached more. Recovery from intense physical exertion took longer. His night vision wasn't as sharp as it once was, but he also knew he had advantages no young adventurer possessed. He had decades of practical experience. He knew how to read nature's signs, identify dangers before they became fatal, and remain calm in situations where others would panic. He knew that the mind, when properly trained, can compensate for many of the body's limitations. And then there was Thor. You can't talk about William without talking about Thor. The two were inseparable. Thor was a 6-year-old German shepherd, trained from puppyhood for military operations. He was no ordinary pet. Thor had undergone rigorous training that taught him to detect danger, protect his handler in combat situations, and follow complex commands, even under extreme stress. He had an incredibly keen sense of smell, capable of detecting changes in the environment that would be imperceptible to a human. Most importantly, Thor shared a deep bond with William. The two understood each other without needing many words or commands. A look, a subtle gesture, and Thor knew exactly what to do. William adopted Thor when the dog was removed from active service after a minor injury to his hind leg. The injury wasn't serious, but it was enough to make Thor unfit for high-risk missions. For William, it was an opportunity. He saw in Thor not just a companion, but a true partner, someone who understood the language of survival, who didn't complain, who didn't question, and who would be by his side no matter what. In the years that followed, William and Thor became a legendary duo in Montana survival circles. They participated in extreme training, hiked through dense forests during storms, and camped in places where temperatures dropped below freezing. Thor saved William more than once, whether by warning of wild animals or finding water when supplies were depleted. And William, in turn, cared for Thor with a dedication that went beyond the call of duty. It was mutual respect, absolute trust. So when William decided to take on the challenge of the Forbidden Mountain, there was no doubt that Thor would go along. In fact, William wouldn't consider doing it without his dog, because he knew that if something went wrong, if he got hurt or lost, Thor would be his only hope of survival. The dog knew the way back. The dog could get help if needed. And most importantly, Thor was a constant reminder that William wasn't completely alone on this journey. But why 72 hours? Why not a shorter challenge of 24 or 48 hours? William chose 72 hours because he knew this was the critical period. The first 24 hours are full of adrenaline, of pent-up energy. You're focused, alert, and full of determination. But after that, when fatigue begins to set in, when your body craves rest and your mind begins to question your choices, that's when the real test begins. And in the last 24 hours, when resources are low, when fatigue has taken over and the urge to give up hits hard, that's when you discover what you're truly made of. William also set strict rules for himself. He would carry only the essentials: a backpack with a waterproof top, a survival knife, an empty canteen, a basic first aid kit, and clothing suitable for temperature fluctuations. No prepared food, no cell phone, no communication devices. If anything went wrong, he would have to rely on his own abilities and Thor's loyalty. There would be no easy rescue. There would be no shortcuts. When William announced his plan to a few close friends, the reaction was mixed. Some admired his courage. Others thought he was being reckless. Some openly said he was too old for this kind of adventure, that he should leave it to the young. But William just smiled. He had expected these reactions, and deep down, they only strengthened his resolve, because he wasn't doing it to impress anyone. He was doing it to prove to himself that he was still capable, that he could still face the unknown head-on, that life doesn't end when you turn 70. And there was something else, something William didn't speak openly about, but which was always in the back of his mind. He wanted to leave a legacy, not a legacy of words or awards, but a legacy of action. He wanted future generations to know that it's possible to live intensely until your last day. That you don't have to accept the image society tries to impose on the elderly. That respect doesn't come from age, but from the choices you make and the courage you demonstrate. So, on a clear October morning, William and Thor set out. The mountain loomed ahead, imposing and silent, shrouded in a light mist that gave the place an even more mysterious air. William glanced at his dog, who stood at his side, alert and ready. He adjusted his pack, took a deep breath, and took the first step toward the unknown. He didn't know, of course, that those 72 hours would change his life in ways he could never have predicted. He didn't know that Thor would do something that would challenge everything he thought he knew about survival. He didn't know that the mountain held secrets that no amount of military training or life experience could have prepared him for. But he was ready, or at least he thought he was. And as William and Thor began to climb, leaving the known world behind, the mountain watched them silently, as if it had been waiting a long time for someone brave enough to challenge its limits. And now, finally, that someone had arrived. The first steps were deceptively calm. The terrain was steep, but nothing William couldn't handle. The vegetation was dense in some parts, sparse in others. The air was cool, almost pleasant. Thor walked ahead, occasionally stopping to sniff the air and check for any danger nearby. Everything seemed under control. But William knew this sense of calm was temporary. The mountain had its secrets, and he was only just beginning to uncover them. As he climbed, William couldn't help but think of the stories he'd heard, the warnings from locals, the legends about people who never returned. He wasn't superstitious, but he wasn't foolish either. He knew there was a reason this place had such a dark reputation, and part of him, a small but present part, wondered if he'd underestimated the challenge. But it was too late to turn back now. He had committed, and William Harper wasn't the kind of man to give up once he'd taken the first step. Thor, for his part, seemed perfectly at ease. The dog was in his element, exploring the environment with curiosity and attention. Every now and then he glanced back, checking to see if William was keeping up. It was as if Thor was saying, "I'm here, I'm watching, you can trust me." And William did, with his life, if necessary. As they climbed, the sun began to move across the sky, casting long shadows between the trees. William knew he needed to find a suitable place to set up camp before night fell. He needed a spot sheltered from the wind, close to a water source if possible, and with enough visibility to spot any approaching danger. It was the first big decision of the challenge, and he couldn't afford to make a mistake. After a few hours of walking, William found what looked like a good spot. It was a small clearing surrounded by rocks on one side and dense trees on the other. The ground was relatively flat, and there were signs of water running through it during rains, though it was currently dry. It wasn't perfect, but it would do. William took off his backpack, felt the immediate relief on his shoulders, and began setting up camp. Thor lay nearby, watching William's every move closely. The dog was relaxed but never completely inattentive. His ears moved, picking up every sound in the surrounding forest. His eyes constantly scanned the environment. For Thor, this wasn't just an adventure. It was work, and he took his work very seriously. William set up a basic shelter using the tarp he'd brought and some branches he found nearby. It wasn't luxurious, but it would protect him from the night's humidity and possible rain. Then he began gathering materials for a fire. He knew fire would be essential, not only for warmth, but also for warding off wild animals and keeping his spirits up at night. Making a fire without matches or a lighter was a skill William had mastered for decades. But even so, it required patience and technique. He found flint and chert among the rocks, gathered dry moss and small twigs for tinder, and began the process. The first sparks didn't catch, nor did the second, but William took his time. He knew that haste led to error, and error could be costly in survival situations. He adjusted the angle, increased the speed of his strikes, and finally a small ember began to glow in the dry moss. William blew gently, fed the ember with more material, and within minutes a small flame danced before him. Thor approached the fire, enjoying the warmth. William smiled as he watched the cub settle in. For a moment, everything seemed to be going well. But William knew this was only the beginning. The first few hours were always the easiest. The real challenge would come later, when the body began to miss food, when exhaustion set in, when the mind began to play tricks. As night fell over the mountain, William sat by the fire and gazed up at the sky. The stars were beginning to appear, countless and bright. It was a sight he never tired of seeing, and for a brief moment he allowed himself to relax. He had completed the first part of the challenge. He had found a safe place, set up a shelter, and managed to make a fire. These were small victories, but important ones. Thor, lying beside William, let out a long sigh. The dog seemed content, comfortable, but even so his ears remained alert, and every now and then he would lift his head, peering into the darkness beyond the reach of the firelight, as if hearing something William couldn't hear. And perhaps he did, because the mountain was far from silent. There were sounds everywhere. The wind moving through the trees, small animals moving through the vegetation, and something else, something distant but present, something William couldn't yet identify, but which made the hairs on the back of Thor's neck stand up slightly. William noticed the change in the dog's behavior. Thor wasn't scared, but he was alert, and that was enough to make William watch out as well. He added more wood to the fire, ensuring the flames remained high. He knew the light and warmth of the fire were his best defenses during the night, and he also knew that in the coming hours, as he tried to rest, he would rely completely on Thor's instincts to detect any approaching danger. The night wore on slowly. William lay down in the makeshift shelter, wrapped in his jacket, trying to conserve body heat. Thor remained outside near the fire, taking up a guard position. William closed his eyes, but sleep did not come easily. His mind was active, replaying every detail of the day, planning what he needed to do in the next few hours. And deep down, he couldn't completely ignore the feeling that something was different about this place. Something he couldn't name, but it was definitely there. And then, in the middle of the night, Thor began to growl softly. William opened his eyes immediately, all his senses on high alert. He stood slowly, gripping the survival knife he always kept within reach. The fire was still burning, casting dancing shadows around the camp. Thor stood tensely, staring into the darkness beyond the trees. His hackles rose, and his growl grew more intense. William followed Thor's gaze, trying to see what the dog had detected, but there was nothing visible. Only the dense darkness of the night forest, only the sound of the wind, only that growing sense that they were not alone. And it was in that moment that William understood why that mountain had the reputation it did, because there was something there, something watching, something waiting. And the next 72 hours would reveal whether William and Thor were prepared to face whatever it was. Thor continued growling for a few more minutes, his muscles tense, his entire body on high alert. William remained beside the dog, knife in hand, his eyes scanning the darkness for any movement, any sign of what had caught Thor's attention. But there was nothing, or at least nothing that William could see, and perhaps that was precisely what made the situation all the more unsettling. Because Thor didn't react like this without reason. After years of working together, William had learned to completely trust the dog's instincts. If Thor sensed something was wrong, then something was wrong. After what seemed like an eternity, Thor finally relaxed a little. The growl faded to a low rumble in his throat, then stopped completely. The dog was still vigilant, but the extreme tension had passed. Whatever was there had either moved away or decided not to come any closer to the camp. William let out a long breath he hadn't even realized he'd been holding. He ran his hand through Thor's fur, a gesture of silent thanks, and the dog responded by nuzzling William's leg for a brief moment. But sleep didn't come easily to William that night. He stayed awake, feeding the fire, keeping it strong and alive. The light from the flames was a small but significant comfort in the dark immensity of the mountain, and Thor remained by his side, sharing the vigil, the two of them forming a team that had been through so many difficult situations that this kind of tension was almost familiar. Almost, but not quite, because there was something different about that mountain. Something William couldn't quite identify, but which he felt in the air, in the heavy silence that enveloped the place. When the first light of morning finally began to break over the horizon, William felt genuine relief. The night had passed without major incident, but also without adequate rest. He knew he would need to manage his energy carefully in the coming days. At 71, he couldn't afford to go without sleep for long periods. But at the same time, he also knew he couldn't let his guard down. Not in this place. Thor, on the other hand, seemed in perfect condition. The dog stood up, gave a long stretch, and began sniffing around the camp, inspecting the perimeter as he did every morning. William watched the animal work, admiring once again Thor's dedication and discipline. It was no wonder he had been trained for military operations. Thor had a work ethic that many humans could not match. William carefully extinguished the fire, ensuring there were no live embers that could start a forest fire. He then dismantled the makeshift shelter, stowed the tarp in his backpack, and prepared to continue the climb. Today would be the most physically challenging day. He needed to gain significant altitude, and the terrain would only get steeper and more difficult from here on out. But he was determined. He hadn't come this far to give up on day 2. Before leaving, William stopped for a moment and really studied Thor. The dog stood on a small rocky outcrop, staring at the trail ahead, ears pricked, tail slightly raised. There was something almost majestic about the animal's posture. And William realized, not for the first time, that Thor wasn't just a working dog. He was a true companion, a partner who had chosen to be there, who trusted him as much as he trusted Thor. The story of how Thor came into William's life was something he liked to recall in difficult times. Thor wasn't a gift or an ordinary purchase. He was a workmate who became family. When William was still working as a survival instructor for military units, he often trained alongside war dogs and their handlers. It was fascinating to see how these animals were trained, how they learned complex commands, how they developed skills that seemed almost supernatural. Thor was one of the unit's most promising dogs. He had been bred specifically for military service, the offspring of a line of German shepherds that had served for generations. From a young age, Thor demonstrated above-average intelligence, an exceptional sense of smell, and a learning ability that impressed even the most experienced handlers. He was assigned to search and rescue operations, where his ability to find people in hostile environments saved countless lives. But during a particularly difficult mission in mountainous terrain, Thor suffered an injury to his right hind leg. It wasn't catastrophic, just a severe sprain that required a few weeks of recovery. However, military protocols were clear. Any dog that exhibited even temporary physical limitations was re-evaluated for its fitness to continue active duty. And Thor, despite his full recovery, was deemed unfit for future high-risk operations. That's when William stepped in. He'd known Thor for years and had worked directly with the dog on several training sessions. He knew the animal had much more to offer than the bureaucratic protocols suggested. William offered to adopt Thor, and after some paperwork and negotiations, the request was approved. And so began a partnership that would last years and prove essential in countless situations. In their first months together, William and Thor established a routine. They walked together every morning, regardless of the weather. They did training exercises, keeping Thor's skills sharp. William taught the dog new commands, adapted for civilian survival situations. And Thor, in turn, taught William to trust even more deeply in his animal instincts, to read cues in the environment that he would never have noticed on his own. There was one occasion, about 2 years after adoption, when Thor literally saved William's life. They were on a training expedition in the Rocky Mountains, testing winter survival gear. William was crossing what appeared to be solid ground, when Thor, walking a few meters ahead, stopped abruptly and began barking insistently. William stopped immediately, trusting the dog's warning. Seconds later, he realized he was just steps away from a deep crevasse covered in a thin layer of snow. Had Thor not alerted him, William would have fallen straight into that natural trap and likely wouldn't have survived. Since then, the bond between the two has deepened even further. It wasn't just mutual respect. It was a genuine connection, almost telepathic at times. William could read Thor's body language with astonishing precision. A twitch of an ear, a shift in posture, the intensity of a gaze, all of it communicated volumes. And Thor, in turn, seemed to understand William's moods, his needs, his moments of doubt or confidence. But Thor wasn't just a tireless worker. He also had personality. There were times when the dog displayed a surprising sense of humor, like the time William was trying to impress some visitors with his tracking skills. And Thor deliberately chose the longest, most complicated route just to make William work harder. Or when Thor would steal William's boot in the morning and hide it, forcing him to search for it before they could begin their daily walk. These little antics showed that behind that disciplined and professional exterior lay an animal with wills and feelings of its own. And then there was the unwavering loyalty. Thor would never abandon William, no matter how difficult the situation became. No matter how tired or injured he was, Thor would always stay by his human's side. This wasn't just training. It was devotion. It was love, in the purest sense of the word, between a man and his dog. William remembered a conversation he'd had with a veterinarian specializing in working dogs. The vet had said something that stuck with him. He said that dogs like Thor don't see their humans as just owners or trainers. They see them as pack members, as family. And in a pack, you protect yours. You fight for yours. You never abandon yours. This was the essence of what Thor represented to William, and what William hoped to represent to Thor. As they continued climbing the mountain that morning, William couldn't help but feel profound gratitude for having Thor by his side. He knew that if he were doing this alone, completely alone, the chances of success would be much lower. Not only because of the physical risks, but also because of the psychological toll of isolation. Having Thor there was a constant reminder that he wasn't completely alone, that there was someone relying on him, depending on him, and at the same time, someone he could trust and depend on. The terrain was becoming more challenging. The rocks were loose in some sections, requiring extra care with each step. The vegetation was thinning, giving way to exposed rocks and areas where the wind blew harder. William could feel the air thinning, the altitude increasing. His lungs worked harder to process the available oxygen. His legs began to feel the strain of the accumulated effort. But he continued step after step, always watching Thor, always using the dog as a guide for proper pacing. Thor, for his part, seemed tireless. He climbed with ease, his physique perfectly adapted for this type of terrain. Every now and then, he would stop and look back, waiting for William to catch up, and then continue. There was no impatience in this behavior. It was just Thor being Thor, always one step ahead, always checking, always ready. As the day progressed, William began searching for signs of water. His canteen had been empty since the night before, and he knew that dehydration was one of the greatest dangers in survival situations. The human body can go weeks without food, but only days without water. And during intense physical activity, as he was doing, the need for hydration was even more critical. He looked for signs of moisture in the soil, for greener vegetation that indicated the presence of groundwater, for marks on the rocks that suggested water had flowed there recently. Thor was also searching. William noticed the dog sniffing the air more frequently, occasionally straying from the main path to investigate small depressions in the ground. And then, after nearly 2 hours of searching, Thor stopped abruptly and began digging in a specific spot. William quickly approached, watching. The dog had found something. The earth was damp there, noticeably different from the dry soil around it. William knelt down and began digging alongside Thor, using his hands and his survival knife. A few inches below the surface, water began to appear. It wasn't much, just a small pool in a rocky depression, but it was water. William waited a few minutes for more liquid to accumulate, then used his canteen to scoop up as much as possible. The water was cloudy, full of sediment, but William had enough experience to know how to handle it. He used a piece of cloth from his backpack as a makeshift filter, removing most of the visible impurities. It wasn't ideal, but it was enough to keep him hydrated for the time being. He offered Thor water first, pouring some into his cupped hand so the dog could drink. Thor drank greedily, his tongue working quickly to absorb every drop. Then William drank too. The water tasted minerally, a little bitter, but to someone thirsty, it was like nectar. He refilled the canteen, making sure he had reserves for the next few hours. It was incredible how Thor had found that water. William would probably have passed right by without noticing, but Thor had smelled the moisture in the air, had detected signals invisible to the human senses. It was yet another demonstration of the dog's extraordinary abilities, and yet another reason William was so grateful to have him by his side. With their thirst partially quenched, they continued. The sun was high now, and the heat was becoming a factor. William adjusted his jacket, tying it around his waist, and continued wearing only a long-sleeved shirt. He knew he needed to protect his skin from the sun, but he also needed to allow his body to regulate its temperature properly. It was a delicate balance, especially at altitude where the sun burned more intensely due to the thinner atmosphere. Thor was also feeling the heat. His tongue lolled out of his mouth, and he panted regularly. William knew he needed to monitor the dog closely. Dogs don't sweat like humans. They regulate their temperature primarily through breathing and their paw pads. If Thor began to show signs of heat exhaustion, William would have to stop and find shade immediately. But Thor was fine. Tired, yes, but fine. And they continued climbing. Each meter of altitude gained a small victory. William began to enter that mental state he knew well from his decades of experience in extreme situations. It was a state where physical discomfort became secondary, where the mind took over and simply ordered the body to continue. It was meditative in a sense. Just the rhythm of his breathing, the sound of his footsteps, Thor's constant presence at his side. The hours passed. The sun began its descent toward the horizon. William knew he would need to find another place to camp before darkness fell again. And this time, he wanted to find something better, somewhere with more protection, perhaps with easier access to water. He began paying closer attention to the surrounding terrain, looking for possibilities. It was Thor who found it. The dog suddenly veered off the path they'd been following and began exploring an area between large rock formations. William followed curiously, and then he saw it. There was a small cave there, not very deep, but deep enough to offer significant shelter from the elements. The floor was relatively flat, covered by a thin layer of sand and small pebbles. Even better, there were signs that water had run off the rocks above during rains, creating a small natural pool in a depression just inside the entrance. It was perfect, or at least as close to perfect as William could hope to find in that hostile environment. He dropped his backpack, feeling the immediate relief in his shoulders and back. Thor entered the cave, sniffed every corner carefully, and then returned to William, clearly satisfied with his choice. It was safe. It was protected. It was home, at least for that night. William set up camp more carefully this time. He had learned the night before that he needed to be better prepared. He organized his belongings more efficiently, established a designated fire pit right at the cave entrance where smoke could easily escape, and created a makeshift barrier with branches and rocks to block part of the entrance, keeping the heat in while still allowing adequate ventilation. Thor lay at the back of the cave, watching William work. The dog looked tired but satisfied. He had done his job. He had found water in the morning, guided William to suitable shelter, and kept constant watch throughout the day. Now it was time to rest. But even as he rested, Thor remained alert. His ears continued to move, picking up sounds from the outside. His eyes, though half closed, still watched. When William finally managed to light another fire, and the flames began to illuminate the cave's interior, he sat down and allowed himself a moment of reflection. They had completed almost 2 full days of the 72-hour challenge. They had faced hardships, but they were okay. They were alive. They were together. And William knew, deep in his heart, that much of that was due to Thor. He looked at the dog, now slumbering peacefully, and said softly, "Thanks, partner. I don't know if I could do this without you." Thor opened one eye, looked at William for a long moment, and then closed it again, as if to say, "I know, and that's why I'm here." But what neither knew, as the second night fell upon the Forbidden Mountain, was that the true challenge was yet to come. That in the coming hours, Thor would do something that would completely change the course of their journey. That the mountain was about to reveal one of its deepest and most disturbing secrets, and that the bond between man and cub would be tested in a way that not even decades of experience and training could have prepared for. The second night began very differently than the first. William was more prepared this time. The fire burned brightly and steadily at the cave entrance, casting dancing shadows on the rocky walls. The shelter offered significant protection from the wind, which had begun to blow stronger with the onset of darkness. Thor lay close to the fire, his body relaxed, but his senses still alert. Everything seemed under control, but there was something in the air, a barely perceptible tension that William couldn't quite identify. The rules of the challenge were clear and uncompromising. William had established from the outset that there would be no easing, no shortcuts, 72 hours on the mountain with as little equipment as possible, no prepared food, no communication devices, no GPS, no way to call for outside help. If anything went wrong, he would have to rely solely on his own survival skills and Thor's loyalty. There would be no rescue team waiting at the base of the mountain. There would be no helicopter ready to be deployed. It was William, Thor, and the mountain. Nothing else. This was the essence of the true survival challenge, and William knew it better than most. He had spent decades teaching others the fundamental principles of survival in extreme environments. And the first principle, the most important of all, was always this: you must be mentally prepared for the possibility that things won't go as planned. You must accept that nature doesn't care about your plans, your experience, or your good intentions. Nature simply exists indifferent and unforgiving. William had brought only the absolute essentials. His backpack contained a waterproof tarp for temporary shelter, a high-quality survival knife with a carbon steel blade, a metal canteen that could be used for both storing and boiling water, a basic first aid kit with bandages, disinfectant, and some essential medications, flint for making fire, 50 meters of paracord, and a small coil of thin wire that had multiple uses. Additionally, he wore clothing suitable for varying temperatures, a long-sleeved shirt made of moisture-wicking material, sturdy pants made of reinforced fabric, a waterproof jacket and hiking boots he had worn for years, and that knew every curve of his feet. For Thor, William had brought only a lightweight tactical vest the dog was accustomed to wearing, equipped with small pockets for emergency supplies and a collapsible silicone water bowl. Thor didn't need much. He was, in many ways, better adapted to the environment than William himself. The rules also included that William could not bring prepared food. He would have to find his own sustenance for the 72 hours. This meant identifying edible plants, possibly hunting small game if the opportunity arose, or simply fasting. William was mentally prepared to go 3 days with little or no food. He had done prolonged fasts before during training. He knew that the human body could function surprisingly well without food for short periods, especially if water was available. But there was another rule, perhaps the most important of all. If something went critically wrong, if there was a serious medical emergency, William had left clear instructions with a trusted friend in the city. If he didn't make contact by a certain time, 3 days after his departure, then and only then was that friend to contact the authorities and provide the approximate location of William's planned stay. It was a minimum safety measure, a safety net of last resort. But William sincerely hoped he wouldn't need it. The pact between William and Thor was simple and profound. If anything happened to William, if he was seriously injured or incapacitated, Thor would be his only real chance of survival. The dog knew the way back. Thor could, theoretically, descend the mountain alone and get help. William had even trained Thor with a specific command that meant just that. Go get help. It was a command he hoped he would never have to use, but one that existed as a last resort. On the other hand, William had also made a pact with himself. If anything happened to Thor, if the dog became injured or sick, the challenge would end immediately. No glory or test of endurance was worth Thor's life or well-being. The dog was not a tool. He was a partner, a companion, practically family, and William would never put a personal challenge above Thor's safety. As the fire crackled at the cave entrance, William mentally reviewed these agreements and rules. It was important to do this periodically, especially in situations of prolonged stress, where the temptation to break one's own rules might arise. It was easy to start rationalizing. Well, maybe I can use some of the emergency food I technically shouldn't have brought. Or maybe I can turn on my phone just for a minute to check everything is okay. But William knew that starting to compromise was the beginning of the end. Either you followed the rules you set, or the challenge lost its meaning. Thor's head snapped up. His ears pricked in full attention. William immediately noticed the change in the dog's behavior. His muscles tensed, and he turned toward the cave entrance, focusing on something outside. William remained silent, waiting, watching. Thor wasn't growling this time, which was interesting. The night before, when something had caught his attention, the dog had growled defensively. But now he was simply hyper-alert, as if processing sensory information that didn't necessarily pose an immediate threat, but was definitely unusual. William slowly rose and approached the cave entrance, standing beside Thor. He gazed into the darkness beyond the reach of the firelight. The night was clear, with a crescent moon providing some natural light. He could see the silhouettes of trees swaying gently in the wind. He could hear the steady sound of air moving between rocks. But there was nothing obviously threatening. Nothing that would explain why Thor was so focused. And then William heard it. It was a distant sound, barely audible above the roar of the wind. A sound he couldn't immediately place. It was low, repetitive, almost rhythmic. It wasn't an animal, at least not like any animal William knew. It wasn't the howl of a coyote or the roar of a cougar. It wasn't the sound of rushing water or snapping branches. It was something different. Something that made the hairs on the back of William's neck stand up slightly. Thor was still focused, his head tilted slightly, as if trying to determine the exact direction the sound was coming from. The cub took a few steps out of the cave, stopping at the edge of the firelight. William followed, staying close. He trusted Thor's instincts, but he also knew he needed to be cautious. The mountain at night was a dangerous place, full of unseen hazards. The sound continued for a few more minutes, and then abruptly ceased. The silence that followed seemed even more intense than before. Thor remained still for a long moment, then gradually relaxed. He looked at William, as if to say, "It's okay for now, but stay alert." William nodded, running his hand through the dog's fur in acknowledgement, and the two of them returned to the cave. William added more wood to the fire, ensuring it would stay strong throughout the night. He knew he needed to try to rest, but he also knew sleep would be difficult. His mind was overactive, processing everything that had happened, everything that could yet happen. He lay down on the cave floor, using his backpack as a makeshift pillow, and pulled his jacket over himself as a blanket. Thor positioned himself between William and the cave entrance, assuming his role as night guard. The hours passed slowly. William fell into a light, shallow sleep, waking frequently at the slightest unusual sound. Each time he awoke, he saw Thor, ever watchful, ever attentive. The dog was tireless in his dedication, and William felt a surge of gratitude and respect each time he opened his eyes and saw that familiar figure standing guard. But then, in the middle of the night, something changed dramatically. William woke suddenly, not because of a sound, but because of the absence of sound. The wind had completely stopped. The forest was utterly silent. It was an unnatural, heavy, oppressive silence. And Thor stood, tense again, but this time there was something different in his demeanor. The dog wasn't just alert. He was restless, almost anxious. William stood up quickly, all his senses on high alert. Thor began pacing back and forth at the cave entrance, occasionally glancing outside and then back at William, as if trying to communicate something urgent. It was behavior William had never seen before in Thor. The cub was normally calm and collected, even in stressful situations. But now there was an agitation in him that was deeply concerning. And then Thor did something completely unexpected. He grabbed William's jacket sleeve with his teeth, gently but firmly, and began to pull. It was a behavior Thor had been trained to do in specific situations, when he needed to guide someone away from danger or towards something important. But why now? Why in the middle of the night? What had Thor detected? William didn't hesitate. Years of experience working with war dogs had taught him a fundamental lesson. When your dog is trying to tell you something, you listen, always. He quickly pulled on his boots, grabbed his survival knife and allowed Thor to lead him out of the cave. The night was eerily clear. The moon provided enough light to see the immediate terrain, though the shadows were deep and deceptive. Thor began moving in a specific direction, not along the path they had climbed during the day, but at a sideways angle, toward an area William had not yet explored. The dog moved with purpose, pausing occasionally to make sure William was following, then continuing on. William felt a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. Where was Thor taking him? What had the dog detected that was so important it couldn't wait until morning? And why was the forest so silent? Even the nocturnal insects, which normally created a constant symphony of sounds, were completely silent. It was as if the entire mountain were holding its breath. They walked for about 15 minutes, carefully navigating the rocky and uneven terrain. William had to rely completely on Thor, because the moonlight, while helpful, created deep shadows that were easy to trip or misstep in. Thor, with his superior night vision, moved confidently, constantly checking to make sure William was keeping up. And then Thor stopped. They had reached an area where large rock formations created a sort of natural corridor. The stone walls rose up on either side, covered in moss and sparse vegetation. And at the end of this corridor, there was something that made William stop completely and just stare in silence. There was an opening in the rocks. It wasn't an ordinary cave, but something that looked like it had been partially carved by human hands sometime in the distant past. The edges were too regular to be entirely natural. There were markings on the stones, time-worn symbols that William didn't recognize, and from within this opening came a very faint, almost imperceptible sound. It was water. Running water. Thor approached the opening, sniffed carefully, and then looked at William as if to say, "This is it. This is what I wanted to show you." William approached slowly, all his senses alert. He flicked on the small pocket knife that had a built-in LED flashlight, a minimal technological concession he'd allowed in his basic gear. The dim light revealed the interior of the opening. It was a narrow passage that cut deep into the rock, and at the bottom of this passage ran a small stream of crystal-clear water. The water gleamed in the flashlight, pure and clean in a way that contrasted sharply with the murky, sediment-laden water William had encountered during the day. This was spring water, water that welled up from somewhere deep within the mountain, filtered naturally through layers of rock over what must have been decades or centuries. William knelt and touched the water with his hand. It was ice cold, so cold it almost hurt his fingers. He smelled it. There was no odor of decay or contamination. He tasted a little, just enough to test. The taste was clean, slightly mineral, but definitely drinkable. This water was safe, more than safe. It was probably the best water he would find on the entire mountain. Thor had saved William once again. The dog had detected this water source, likely by the sound or smell of moisture in the air, even from this distance, even in the middle of the night. And he had insisted on bringing William here because he knew, somehow, that it was important, that William would need this water in the coming days. But there was something more about this place. William could feel it. It wasn't just the water. There was something in the atmosphere, something in the way the air moved through that narrow passage, something in the symbols etched into the rocks around the entrance. This place had history. This place had meaning. And William was beginning to understand why the mountain was considered off-limits by the locals. He filled his canteen completely with the fresh water, drank deeply, and offered Thor water from the collapsible bowl. The cub drank eagerly, clearly pleased to have found this valuable source. And then, just as William was about to suggest they return to the cave, Thor tensed again. The dog stared into the passage, into the darkness beyond the reach of the small flashlight. His ears were fully erect, his body completely still, and William realized that Thor wasn't just detecting water. There was something else in there, something the dog could sense, but William hadn't yet realized. And then William heard again that strange sound he had detected earlier in the night. But now it was closer, much closer, and it seemed to be coming from inside the passage, echoing off the stone walls. It was a low sound, almost a groan, but not entirely organic. It was as if the mountain itself were breathing, producing sounds that made no complete sense to the human mind. Thor took a step back, positioning himself between William and the opening. It wasn't fear in the dog's behavior. It was deep caution. It was the protective instinct kicked into high gear, and William, trusting that instinct completely, also stepped back. They returned to the cave in silence, Thor always keeping between William and any direction from which danger might arise. And when they finally reached the shelter, with the fire still burning low but steady at the entrance, they both sat in silence for a long moment, processing what they had experienced. William knew he had found something important that night. The water, yes, but also something else. A mystery, a secret the mountain held. And he knew that Thor, with his keen instincts and unwavering loyalty, would be essential to unraveling that mystery in the remaining days of the challenge. But what neither could have foreseen was that this discovery of the water and the mysterious passage was only the beginning. That in the coming hours, as the third day dawned, events would unfold that would test not only their survival skills, but their very understanding of what was possible on that ancient and forbidding mountain. As the first light of the third day began to filter through the cave entrance, William awoke feeling the accumulated weight of the last 48 hours. His body ached in ways he hadn't felt in years. His joints were stiff. His muscles protested with every movement. At 71 years old, even with all the experience and physical fitness he maintained, his body simply wasn't recovering as quickly as it had when he was younger. But his mind was clear, focused, and that, William knew, was what truly mattered in extreme survival situations. Thor was awake, as always, positioned at the cave entrance, observing the outside world. The dog turned his head when he noticed William moving, and their eyes met for a moment. There was a silent understanding there. They had endured a strange night together, had discovered something inexplicable, and now they would face together whatever the day brought. The first 24 hours of any survival challenge are always the easiest, relatively speaking. Your body is still full of stored energy. Your mind is fresh and optimistic. Adrenaline flows strongly, keeping you alert and motivated. This is the period where you establish your base camp, find initial resources, and create the basic structure for the following days. William had spent decades teaching this to young soldiers and inexperienced adventurers. It's easy to be brave and confident on the first day, but the second day is where things start to change. Fatigue sets in. Your body begins to feel the lack of adequate nutrition. Minor discomforts you ignored on the first day become persistent irritations. Your mind begins to question the decisions that seemed so solid at first. And it's at this point that many people give up, even if they don't openly admit it. They start to rationalize, finding excuses to end the challenge sooner than planned. William had made it through the second day. He had faced increasing exhaustion, thirst, unexplained sounds in the darkness, and the unsettling discovery of the mysterious passage. But now I was on the third day, and this was traditionally the most challenging of all in a 72-hour test. This was the day where everything you had stored up, all your accumulated willpower, would be tested to the limit. The human body can go weeks without food, but the effects of food deprivation begin to manifest quickly. After 48 hours without eating, metabolism begins to change. The body enters a state where it begins to burn fat reserves more aggressively. Blood sugar levels fluctuate, causing moments of dizziness and disorientation. Mental concentration becomes more difficult. Decisions take longer to make, and the temptation to abandon the challenge becomes almost unbearable. William knew all this. He had studied the physiology of food deprivation extensively during his military career and as an instructor. He had even intentionally fasted for extended periods as part of his own training. But knowing the theory and experiencing it in reality were very different things. And on this third day, he could feel every symptom he had read about in books and manuals manifesting in his own body. He stood up slowly, allowing his blood to circulate properly before attempting to stand fully. A slight dizziness. It was expected. He waited for it to pass, breathing deeply, and then began a series of gentle stretches to ease the muscle stiffness. Thor watched, waiting patiently. The dog was also feeling the effects of the accumulated exertion. William could tell. Thor moved a little more slowly, his paws probably sore after 2 days of navigating uneven rocky terrain. William checked Thor's paw pads carefully. It was something he did religiously every morning during expeditions. A dog's paws are tough, but not indestructible. Sharp rocks, thorns, or abrasive terrain can cause cuts and abrasions that, if left untreated, can quickly become serious problems. Fortunately, Thor's paws were fine. A little rough, but without cuts or signs of infection. William applied some protective balm that he always carried specifically for this purpose. It was one of the few extra items he was allowed to bring, because Thor's health was non-negotiable. The fire had burnt down to embers overnight. William rekindled it, adding dry twigs and small branches until the flames danced again. He needed the fire not so much for warmth, now that day was dawning, but for the psychological sense of security it provided. In prolonged survival situations, the psychological aspect is as important as the physical. Maintaining high morale, maintaining a sense of control over the situation, these things can make the difference between success and failure.